I still remember the way my grandfather's legs looked. A patchwork of shiny, taut skin and jagged ridges, like a terrain permanently scorched by fire. Even as a child, I knew there was a story behind those scars, though no one ever spoke of it in detail. I had only been 7 when he passed away, but that image of his legs, bared one summer day as he rolled up his pant leg to scratch an itch, stayed with me, sharp and vivid, even after the memory of his face began to blur. It was from a fire, my mom would say whenever I asked. An apartment building caught on fire when he was just a boy. He was lucky to make it out alive. That explanation satisfied me for most of my childhood. Fires were scary but impersonal. They weren't something anyone could control, and they didn't have motives. I imagined my grandfather as a brave little boy, scrambling through smoke-filled halls, his legs catching the flames as he ran for his life. It painted him as a survivor, someone who had faced the worst and come out stronger. But years later, when I was 23, that story unraveled, and with it, so did the simple image of my family I had built in my head. It started with a visit to my great-aunt, my grandfather's older sister. She was 85 by then, frail but sharp as a blade. She lived alone in a tiny house filled with faded photographs and the smell of lavender. I had gone to see her out of a vague sense of obligation, hoping to learn more about my grandfather's life. We were sipping tea in her cluttered living room when I brought him up. "What was Grandpa like as a kid?" I asked, hoping for some funny or heartwarming anecdotes. Mom always said he was tough because of the fire. Her expression changed instantly, her smile faltering as her hands tightened around the teacup. For a moment, I thought she hadn't heard me. "What fire?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked, confused. "The fire in the apartment building. When Grandpa got burned." She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the wall behind me. "There wasn't a fire," she said finally. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," I said, laughing nervously. "That's what we were always told." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear us. "Your grandfather didn't get those burns in a fire. It was our father." The world seemed to tilt beneath me as her words sank in. "What do you mean, it was your father?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. She set down her cup with trembling hands. "It was a punishment," she said. "He ran a bath full of scalding water and put your grandfather in it." I stared at her, my stomach twisting into knots. "That's not true," I said automatically, though the way she refused to meet my eyes made it clear that it was. "It is true," she said firmly, her voice tinged with both sadness and anger. "Your grandfather was only 6 years old. He'd misbehaved. I don't even remember what he did. And our father decided he needed to be taught a lesson." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The image of my brave, fire-surviving grandfather shattered, replaced by something far darker. A little boy screaming in pain as he was plunged into scalding water. A father standing over him, unmoved. Why would he do that? I whispered. She shook her head. "Because he was a monster," she said simply. "A cruel, violent man who took his anger out on his children. Your grandfather was his favorite target." I left her house that day feeling like my world had been flipped upside down. The fire story had been a lie, a carefully constructed fiction to cover up something too horrific to admit. I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather as a child, the pain he must have endured, the betrayal he must have felt from the person who was supposed to protect him. But what haunted me even more was the fact that no one had ever told me the truth. My mother, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles, they had all chosen to perpetuate the lie, to bury the darkness beneath a story that painted my grandfather as a hero instead of a victim. I needed answers. I called my mom that night, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. "Did you know?" I demanded as soon as she picked up. "Did you know that Grandpa's burns weren't from a fire?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Who told you that?" she asked finally, her voice tight. "Aunt Margaret," I said. "She said it was his father, that he did it on purpose." My mom sighed heavily. "I didn't want you to know," she said. "You were just a kid when he died. You didn't need to carry that. But why lie about it?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why not tell the truth?" "Because it's painful," she snapped. "Because no one wants to talk about it. We wanted to protect his memory. Isn't that better than dwelling on something we can't change?" I didn't know how to respond. Part of me understood her reasoning, but another part of me felt betrayed. The lie hadn't protected his memory. It had erased the truth of who he was and what he had endured. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with learning more about my grandfather's past. I went through old family albums, searching for clues in the faded photographs. I found one picture of him as a boy, standing stiffly beside his father. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I also started having nightmares. In one, I was standing in a bathroom filled with steam, the walls dripping with condensation. I could hear the sound of water running, and then a child's scream, a high, piercing wail that made my blood run cold. When I turned to look, I saw my grandfather as a little boy, his skin red and blistered, reaching out to me for help. But I couldn't move. I could only watch as the water consumed him. In another dream, I was the one in the bath, the scalding water burning my skin as I thrashed and screamed. A shadowy figure loomed over me, faceless but menacing. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dreams left me shaken, but they also made me realize something important. My grandfather had lived with those memories every day of his life. He had carried the weight of that trauma, those scars, both visible and invisible. And somehow he had survived. One day, I went back to visit Aunt Margaret. I needed to know more about my grandfather, about their father, about how they had managed to escape that house. "We didn't escape," she said when I asked. "Not really. He didn't stop being cruel, just because we grew up. But your grandfather, he was strong. Stronger than me, stronger than any of us. He didn't let what happened define him." I thought about that for a long time. My grandfather had always been a quiet, stoic man, the kind who rarely showed his emotions. Now I understood why. He had spent his whole life hiding his pain, refusing to let it show. "He loved you, you know," Aunt Margaret said, her voice softening. "He used to talk about you all the time. You were the light of his life." Tears filled my eyes. "I wish I'd known him better," I said. "I wish I'd been old enough to ask him about his life." "Maybe it's better you didn't," she said. "Some things are too heavy to carry." The hill behind the old funeral home had always been my favorite place to sled in winter. Its steep, powdery slope seemed endless when I was a kid, and the thrill of barreling down it on my plastic sled made every winter day feel magical. But one afternoon, as I sat at the top of the hill, my dad walked over, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, and told me something that made my stomach drop. "Before you go down," he said, his voice oddly calm, "there's something you should know about this hill." I stared at him, my sled poised to take off. "What?" He hesitated, glancing down at the funeral home at the bottom of the hill, its dark windows staring back at us like empty eyes. "Your grandmother had an affair with the mortician who used to own that place," he said. "She got pregnant, and he performed an abortion. The fetus is buried somewhere back here." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked down at the slope that suddenly didn't seem so inviting. My sled creaked under me, and the cold air stung my face, but neither of those things registered. All I could think about was what my dad had just said. There was a body buried under this hill. The hill where my friends and I had spent countless winters laughing and racing each other, oblivious to what lay beneath. For years, that memory lingered at the edge of my mind, like a shadow that refused to disappear. I avoided the hill after that day, even though my friends kept sledding there. They didn't know, and I wasn't about to tell them. It wasn't just the thought of the buried fetus that disturbed me. It was the realization that my family's history was darker and more tangled than I had ever imagined. I grew up in a small town where everyone seemed to know everything about everyone else. But no one had ever mentioned this about my grandmother. She had always been a figure of quiet dignity in my mind, a woman I only knew through faded photographs and the occasional story my dad would tell. The idea that she had been involved in something so scandalous and so horrifying shattered that image. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the questions haunted me. Why had she turned to the mortician? Was it desperation? Love? And what kind of person was he to agree to something like that? I couldn't ask my dad for more details. He had a way of shutting down when it came to the past, but the silence only made my imagination run wilder. When I was 17, my dad dropped another bombshell. It was a late summer evening, and we were sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies blink in the fading light. He seemed lost in thought, swirling the ice in his glass of iced tea. "Do you remember when I told you about your grandmother and the mortician?" he asked suddenly. I nodded, the memory as vivid as the day it had happened. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Well," he continued, "that's not the only skeleton in the family closet." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Your grandfather, my father, wasn't exactly faithful to your grandmother. He had other children. Around town." "Other children?" I echoed, my voice rising. "You mean like illegitimate kids?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. One of them is your friend Jake's dad. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. Jake had been my best friend since middle school. We'd grown up together, spent countless weekends at each other's houses, played on the same basketball team. And now my dad was telling me we were family? That Jake was my half-cousin? Does Jake know? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No, my dad said. And neither does his dad. Your grandfather kept it quiet, and so did my mom. But it's the truth. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything my dad had told me. My family, which I had always thought of as simple and ordinary, was anything but. My grandmother's affair with the mortician, the abortion, the buried fetus, and now this, my grandfather leaving a trail of children across town, like some kind of small-town Casanova. It wasn't just shocking, it was surreal. These were the kinds of stories you read about in novels or see in soap operas, not the kind you discover about your own family. And the fact that my dad had told me so calmly, like it was just another piece of trivia, made it even harder to wrap my head around. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Jake. Every time I saw him, I felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. Should I tell him? Would he even believe me if I did? And what would it mean for our friendship if he knew? I decided to keep it to myself, but the secret weighed on me. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. How Jake's dad and my dad had the same sharp cheekbones, the same crooked smile. How Jake's laugh sounded eerily familiar, like an echo of someone I couldn't quite place. At the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about the hill behind the funeral home. I hadn't been back there since my dad had told me the truth, but the memory of it loomed large in my mind. I started having nightmares about it, dreams where I was sledding down the hill, only to crash into an open grave. In the dreams, I could see the fetus, tiny and fragile, lying at the bottom of the hill, its eyes open and staring at me. One weekend, I finally decided to confront my dad. I found him in the garage, tinkering with the lawnmower. Why did you tell me all of this? I asked, my voice trembling. About Grandma. About Grandpa. About Jake. He looked up from his work, wiping his hands on a rag. Because you're old enough to know, he said simply. And because it's part of who we are. But it's horrible, I said. How am I supposed to live with this? He set down the rag and looked at me, his expression serious. Everyone has darkness in their past, he said. It doesn't define us. What matters is what we do with it. I wanted to believe him, but it was hard. The darkness didn't feel like something I could overcome. It felt like something that had been passed down to me, a legacy I couldn't escape. That winter, I went back to the hill for the first time in years. It was just as steep and snowy as I remembered, but it felt different now. The sledding kids, their laughter echoing in the cold air, seemed out of place, like they didn't belong in a place with so much buried beneath it. I stood at the top of the hill, holding my sled, and stared down at the funeral home. For a moment, I thought about leaving, about turning my back on the hill and everything it represented. But then I took a deep breath, sat down on the sled, and pushed off. The wind whipped past me as I hurtled down the slope, faster and faster, until I reached the bottom. When I finally came to a stop, I looked back up at the hill, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a hill, just snow and earth and memories. And for the first time, I felt like I could face it. It was a humid summer evening when my family gathered around the old TV in the living room. The air conditioning groaned against the heat, and the faint buzz of cicadas seeped through the walls. My parents, my younger sister, and I were halfway through a rerun of America's Most Wanted. It was one of our guilty pleasures, a mix of fascination and relief as we watched strangers caught up in crimes far removed from our quiet little town. But that night was different. That night, the stranger wasn't a stranger at all. The host's voice carried an urgency that made us all lean forward, a mix of curiosity and dread settling over the room. A grainy photograph flashed across the screen. The man in the picture was heavy-set, his eyes hard and unreadable, his expression as cold as the story that followed. His name was Kenneth Macduff. My dad sat bolt upright, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the arm of his chair. My mom froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. Even my sister, who was only 10 at the time, seemed to sense that something was off. "What's wrong?" I asked, looking between them. My dad didn't answer. He was staring at the screen like he'd seen a ghost. When the host mentioned the name again, Macduff, he muttered, almost to himself, "He's one of ours." I didn't understand at first. The man on the screen was a killer. a monster who had stolen lives and evaded justice for far too long. How could my dad possibly know him? But as the story unfolded, as the pieces came together, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. Kenneth McDuff, the serial killer being hunted across the country, was my dad's first cousin. My blood. The next few days were a blur of whispered conversations and unanswered questions. My dad had grown up in a small, tight-knit family, and while he hadn't seen McDuff in decades, the connection was undeniable. They'd spent summers together as boys, playing in the dusty fields of Texas, long before McDuff's name became synonymous with horror. He was always different, my dad admitted one night after my relentless prodding. Even as a kid, there was something off about him. He was mean, not just to animals, but to other kids. He liked hurting things. I shuddered at the thought, unable to reconcile the image of a cruel boy with the charming, manipulative predator described on the show. McDuff's crimes were beyond comprehension. Murders so brutal they didn't belong in our world, but in some nightmarish fiction. And yet, here he was tied to my family by blood and history. After the initial shock wore off, the questions started piling up in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. How could someone from my family, turn into a monster like that? Was there something in our shared bloodline, some dark inheritance waiting to surface? And most disturbingly, could it happen to me? I tried to push those thoughts away, bury them under the distractions of school and friends, but they kept creeping back, especially at night. I started having nightmares, visions of McDuff's face staring at me from the shadows, his cold eyes watching as I ran but couldn't escape. Sometimes I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, and wonder if he was still out there, alive and hunting. The worst part was the way it changed how I saw my dad. He'd always been my rock, steady, dependable, and fiercely protective. But now, I couldn't help but wonder how much he wasn't telling me. He'd shared a childhood with McDuff, known him in a way no one else could. What had he seen? What had he ignored? And why hadn't he warned us? Did you ever think he could do something like this? I asked him one afternoon, desperate for answers. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Kenneth always had a mean streak, he said. But no, I didn't think he was capable of this. No one did. But he killed people, I said, my voice rising. He tortured them. How do you not see that coming? My dad looked at me, his expression a mix of guilt and sorrow. Sometimes people hide who they really are, he said quietly. And sometimes we don't want to see the truth, even when it's staring us in the face. The more I learned about McDuff, the harder it became to distance myself from him. I devoured every article, every documentary, every detail I could find, hoping to understand how someone so close to my family could turn into a monster. The stories were worse than I could have imagined. He was dubbed the Broomstick Killer for his brutal murders in the 1960s, but it was his release from death row and subsequent killing spree in the 1980s that cemented his infamy. He was a predator, plain and simple, targeting women with a chilling precision that made my skin crawl. And yet, somehow, he always seemed to escape justice, until his eventual capture, after the episode of America's Most Wanted that had shattered my family's illusion of normalcy. As the years went by, the connection to McDuff became a ghost in the background of my life. My dad rarely mentioned him, and I stopped asking. But the knowledge lingered, shaping how I saw the world and myself. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family's bloodline carried something dark, something dangerous. When I was a senior in high school, I had a conversation with my history teacher about nature versus nurture. We were discussing infamous historical figures, and I couldn't help but blurt out, "What if someone's just born evil?" He raised an eyebrow. "Do you think that's possible?" I hesitated, thinking of McDuff. "I don't know," I admitted. "But some people seem broken from the start." The final straw came when I was cleaning out the attic with my dad a few years later. We were sorting through boxes of old photographs when I stumbled across a picture of McDuff as a teenager. He looked normal, ordinary even, standing next to my dad and some other cousins at a family barbecue. His smile was bright, almost charming, but there was something about his eyes that made my stomach twist. "Why do we even have this?" I asked, holding up the photo. My dad glanced at it and frowned. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe it's time to let it go." That night, I burned the photo in the backyard, watching as the flames consumed his image. But even as the ashes scattered, I knew the memory would never truly leave me. To this day, I wrestle with the knowledge of my connection to Kenneth McDuff. It's a dark stain on my family's history, a reminder that evil doesn't always come from somewhere far away. It can be born in your own backyard. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. We are more than the blood that ties us. We are the choices we make, the lives we build, and the love we give. And no matter how deep the darkness runs, we have the power to choose the light. That's what I tell myself, anyway. And on most days, it's enough. When I was 7 years old, I overheard my aunt whispering to my dad in the kitchen. Her voice was low, her words clipped, but I caught a few phrases that didn't make sense. Illegal, animal control, and the basement. I was just a kid, so I didn't think much of it at the time. But years later, as a teenager, I started piecing together bits of my childhood memories. Things that didn't quite add up, things no one ever talked about. By the time I was old enough to confront my mom, I already knew what I was going to ask her. Did we really have a horse in the backyard when we lived in the townhouse? I said one night, as casually as I could manage. She froze for a second, then laughed nervously, brushing it off like it was some silly joke. "Oh, that was a long time ago," she said. "Why do you even remember that?" Her deflection didn't work. I'd seen pictures, grainy, poorly lit snapshots of a massive chestnut horse standing in the tiny patch of grass behind our townhouse. My aunt's whispers came back to me. I wanted the truth, and I wasn't going to let her dodge the question this time. But the truth, as it turned out, was far stranger than I could have imagined. We lived in a modest townhouse in the suburbs when I was little. It was the kind of place where everyone's yard looked the same, small, neat, and boxed in by chain-link fences. There wasn't a lot of room for creativity, but that didn't stop my mom. She had always been a little unconventional. It started with the horse. I don't remember much about the day it arrived, but I have hazy flashes of a trailer pulling up in front of the townhouse and the sound of hooves clattering against the pavement. My mom named him Red. He was huge, easily twice my height even as a young child, and he always seemed out of place in our backyard, standing awkwardly between the barbecue and the flower beds. But Red didn't come alone. He came with a goat. Goats and racehorses are bonded animals, my mom explained to my dad one night after dinner. They need each other to stay calm. It's normal. Normal. That was the word she used. The goat was less of a backyard animal than the horse. Instead of staying outside, it lived in the closet of my nursery. My nursery. I don't know how I didn't notice it at the time. How the strange bleating noises from the closet or the faint smell of hay didn't seem unusual. But I guess when you're that young, you just accept whatever your parents say as reality. It wasn't until I was older that I realized how bizarre it all was. A horse in the backyard of a suburban townhouse? A goat sleeping in the closet of a baby's room? None of it made sense. But as strange as those memories were, they weren't the ones that haunted me. What really unsettled me was the basement. Growing up, I was never allowed to go down there. My mom said it was dangerous, full of tools and sharp edges that could hurt me. My dad, who usually let me get away with anything, was strangely firm about the rule. "The basement is off limits," he'd say, and that was the end of the discussion. But I remember the smell, an earthy, almost sweet scent that would waft up through the cracks in the floorboards. And I remember the faint hum of machinery that seemed to run day and night, like a low, steady heartbeat beneath the house. When I finally asked my mom about it years later, she sighed and said, "It was just a hobby. Nothing serious." But it was serious. By the time I was in high school, I'd figured out enough to confront her about it. The horse, the goat, the basement. I wanted answers, and I wasn't going to let her laugh it off this time. Why did we have a horse in the backyard? I asked her one night, my voice sharper than I'd intended. She hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall as if looking for an excuse to leave the room. It was temporary, she said. He needed a place to stay, and I couldn't just let him go. And the goat? I pressed. Why was there a goat in my nursery closet? Her smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked almost guilty. It kept Red calm, she said quietly. Racehorses get anxious without their companions. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. And the basement? She stiffened. That's none of your business, she snapped. That was the moment I knew. The basement had always been the biggest mystery in our house, the thing my parents had gone out of their way to hide from me. And now, watching my mom's reaction, I understood why. I started digging. It wasn't hard to find out what had been going on. A few late-night searches online, and I had my answer. My mom had been running a grow-op in the basement. Not some small, casual setup, but a full-blown operation. Rows of marijuana plants under glowing lights, fans humming to keep the air circulating. It explained everything, the smell, the humming, the secrecy. But it also raised more questions. How had she managed it without anyone noticing? What would have happened if she'd been caught? And why had she brought a horse and a goat into the mix? The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. My childhood, which I'd always thought of as quirky and endearing, started to feel like something out of a surreal nightmare. The horse in the backyard wasn't just an eccentric choice, it was illegal. The goat in the closet wasn't just a quirky pet, it was part of a setup that made no sense. And the basement? That was the darkest part of all. I started having nightmares about it. In one dream, I was back in the townhouse, standing at the top of the basement stairs. The door was open, and I could see the faint glow of lights from below. I heard the hum of machinery, louder than I remembered, and the faint rustle of something moving in the darkness. When I stepped down, the smell hit me first, earthy and sweet, but also rotten like something decaying. I called out for my mom, but there was no answer. As I moved deeper into the basement, I saw rows of plants stretching out into the shadows. And then I saw the goat, standing motionless in the corner, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. When I turned around, the horse was there, too, its massive body blocking the stairs. Its eyes were hollow, and its breath came in slow, heavy snorts. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The story of my uncle's death was the first tragedy I ever really understood. I was 8 years old when it happened, and the explanation was simple enough for a kid to grasp. A car accident. A rainy night, slick roads, and a sharp curve he couldn't quite handle. Everyone said it was a terrible tragedy, an accident that stole him too soon. For years, that's all I believed. I pictured the crash as something sudden, something unavoidable. A tragic twist of fate. I never questioned it. Why would I? My parents didn't talk much about him, but when they did, it was with a kind of wistful sadness. He was a good man, they'd say. He just made some mistakes. But when I was 17, I found out the truth. It was late at night, and my mom thought I was asleep. I wasn't. I had my earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I heard her and my dad talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but something about the tone made me pull out the earbuds and listen. I still can't believe it sometimes, my mom was saying, that he did something like that. I mean to her, and then to himself. My dad sighed. It's not something anyone likes to think about, but it happened. You can't erase it. My heart started pounding. I slid out of bed and crept closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. I just hate that we've had to lie about it all these years, my mom said. The car accident story. It's not even close to what really happened. I know, my dad said. But what else could we tell people? That he murdered his mistress and stuffed her in the trunk? That he killed himself trying to cover it up? That's not something you can explain at a funeral. I clapped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. My uncle, the man I'd grown up hearing about as kind and charming, was a killer? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. My parents acted normal, like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't look at them the same way. Every time I tried to bring up my uncle casually, my mom would change the subject, her smile a little too tight. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Why did you lie to me? I blurted out one night at dinner. My parents froze, their forks halfway to their mouths. Lie to you about what? My mom asked, though her voice wavered. About Uncle Ray, I said. About how he died. My dad's face darkened. What are you talking about? I heard you last night, I said. I know he didn't die in a car accident. I know what really happened. My mom's hand flew to her chest, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. My dad set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. It's not something you need to know about, he said finally. But I do know, I shot back. I know he killed someone. I don't understand why. My mom and dad exchanged a long, tense look. Finally, my mom sighed. Fine, she said. You want to know the truth? Here it is. According to my mom, my uncle had been having an affair for years. His mistress was a woman named Claire, someone he'd met at work. At first, it was just a fling, something he could keep secret, something that didn't mean much. But Claire wanted more. She wanted him to leave his wife, to start a new life with her. The night he died, they'd had a fight. Claire threatened to tell his wife everything, to ruin his life if he didn't give her what she wanted. My uncle snapped. No one knows exactly how it happened, my mom said, her voice trembling. But he killed her. Strangled her, we think. And then he panicked. My dad took over, his tone grim. He put her body in the trunk of his car and started driving. Maybe he thought he could dump the body somewhere. Maybe he was just trying to get away. But he didn't get far. He crashed the car into a tree going over 100 miles an hour. Killed himself instantly. The police found her body in the trunk, when they arrived. I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. My uncle, who I'd always thought of as this fun, easygoing guy, had murdered someone. He'd ended someone's life in a moment of rage, and then destroyed his own trying to cover it up. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked finally, my voice shaking. "You were a child," my mom said. "We didn't want you to carry that. It was easier to say it was a car accident. People believe accidents. They don't ask questions. But you lied to me," I said. "You made him seem like he was someone he wasn't." "We didn't lie," my dad said. "We just didn't tell you everything. And honestly, I wish you didn't know now." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything they'd told me. My mind kept circling back to Claire. What had she felt in those final moments? Fear? Betrayal? And what about my uncle? How had he gone from being a regular guy to a killer? The worst part was how little closure there was. There were no witnesses, no trial, no answers. Just 2 lives snuffed out in a single, violent night. Over the next few weeks, I started digging into my uncle's past. I looked through old photo albums, scoured online records, even searched for news articles about the crash. The more I learned, the harder it was to reconcile the man I'd known with the man he had become. I found a picture of him at one of my childhood birthday parties, grinning as he held up a balloon animal he'd made for me. In another, he was helping my dad fix a flat tire on the side of the road, his face smeared with grease. He didn't look like a killer. He looked normal. But then I found the police report. The report was cold and clinical, describing the scene of the crash in excruciating detail. Claire's body had been found in the trunk, her hands tied with electrical tape. The cause of death was listed as strangulation. The most chilling detail, though, was the note they found in the car. It was crumpled and bloodstained, but the words were still legible. "I can't fix this." "I'm sorry,"